Welcome, everybody. I wanted to thank all of you for joining me on this webinar on how caregiving changes relationships. These webinars are actually part of a monthly webinar series that Extension Family and Consumer Sciences is providing. And all of our webinars are going to be recorded. And at the end, I'll show you a website that has all of our recorded, a link to the website that has all of our recorded webinars. My name is Karim Martinez, and I'm the Extension Family Life Specialist. And I also wanted to give you a reminder after this webinar is done, I'll close out the session and then a survey will pop up. So really hope that you'll fill out the survey. It'll help us improve our webinars moving forward. And then following the survey, then you'll receive a handout with information from today's presentation. And I mentioned this earlier, but just in case somebody else may have hopped on, the format for today, you all are going to be in listen only mode, but there should be a chat box. On my computer, it's on the right-hand side, but there should be a chat box where you'll be able to type in any questions that you have. And so I'll try to check on that chat box periodically to make sure that I'm answering any questions that you have or any comments that you'd like to share. Okay, so hopefully, and we have about 6 people, so thank you all for attending. So to start out, I wanted to talk a little bit about what is caregiving, what might be considered part of caregiving. And so a really general basic definition is assisting someone with any aspect of their care or their well-being. So that could be a variety of different tasks. And so sometimes we may be helping with these tasks, but it doesn't in our mind think like caregiving, so we don't even identify ourselves as a caregiver. And so this slide just shows some of the tasks that might be involved in that. So it might be helping somebody run their errands or helping with their housework. Or maybe they're unable to do some home repairs that they've been able to do in the past, and so maybe you're helping with that. It could be providing transportation. Maybe you're helping with meal preparation. Some of the some of the things that we typically think about caregiving might be things like bathing or giving medications or going to doctor's appointments. But some other things might be maybe you're on call for emergencies, or maybe you're providing some financial support to someone. Or the next block, it says legal and financial assistance. So this might be maybe you're assisting with paying bills or paying taxes, or maybe helping with insurance forms or credit card or banking. All of those might be involved in financial assistance. And then, of course, emotional support. And actually, emotional support is often a really big part of caregiving, and it's very important. So these are just some of the things that might be involved when you become a caregiver to somebody. So how common is caregiving? So as people are living longer, it increases our chance of becoming a caregiver for maybe it's an aging parent, maybe it's a relative, someone in your family is getting older and may need some help as they get older. But there are also some other situations. So for example, maybe a parent is caring for an adult child with disabilities. Maybe there's a military spouse caring for their partner who received an injury or some kind of disability when they were deployed. So there's actually a wide variety of caregiving situations in families. But from the statistics, you can see that 40.4 million unpaid caregivers are caregiving for adults age 65 and older in the US. So a lot of the caregiving that goes on in the US is for older adults. And who's likely to be a caregiver? Well, the biggest group is actually adults age 45 to 64. So 23% of caregivers fall in that group. But the second most common group is adults age 65 and older. So that's 17%. So typically this might be one person, one spouse or one partner caring for the other person. In terms of gender, the majority of caregiving does occur by women, and so women actually make up to 75% of caregivers. And the other gender differential is that women tend to spend more time providing care, and they're also more likely to provide those personal care tasks. So like dressing, bathing, feeding, those type of tasks. Latinos are more likely to take on a role of caregiver compared to other groups. And when we take all of the caregiving, unfortunately, there aren't, I think, very many resources to provide caregiving to families. And so many times it's unpaid. And so that value of the unpaid caregiving, and this is according to AARP, it exceeds $470 billion. So lots of caregiving going on in families. And just out of curiosity, would anybody in the group like to share if they have either been a caregiver or are a caregiver? I think it's definitely becoming more and more common. Now, some things that affect families in terms of caregiving, one of the aspects is how we become caregivers. So it can happen in a variety of different ways. So, I mean, you saw how many caregivers there are. Everybody's situation can be different, but there are some factors in terms of how we become a caregiver that can influence how our family is affected by it. So, for example, it can occur um, suddenly. So maybe somebody in your family had an accident or suffered a stroke, and so it was just this one very sudden event. Or it can happen gradually. So maybe somebody in the family is diagnosed with a disease like Alzheimer's or maybe rheumatoid arthritis that's getting progressively worse. And so it can be, suddenly or gradually. The duration of the caregiving can also vary. So it can be short term. So again, maybe there's a temporary illness or a temporary injury, and then they get better. And so typically in this type of situations, families can go into this temporary sort of crisis mode, right? So maybe the family routines are disrupted. Maybe everybody's chipping in because it's just this short-term situation. And so there's not a whole lot of planning. It's just, let's just get these, make sure the immediate needs are met. But then it can be long term. So maybe the duration of caregiving is more permanent. So it could be a progressive illness, maybe there's a disease or a disability. Maybe family members might get worse and then get better and then get worse. So it might be this cycle, but overall the time frame is more long term. And then sometimes it seems like it's going to be short term, but then maybe your family member doesn't improve or somehow it turns into a long term situation. And so the challenge for families with long term caregiving situations like this is, especially if you're thinking of it like it's going to be short term, you go more into that crisis mode, right? So you're just making sure immediate needs are met, but then it might drag on to maybe you think it's this short term, but it goes on for weeks and then months, and it could be years. But the challenge with going into that crisis mode is there's not that long-term planning. And that's understandable because you think that it's going to be this short-term commitment and you think that life is going to return to normal, but then it ends up lasting longer than you thought. And so for long-term, planning and prioritizing is going to be key to families to successfully manage that because it's going to have to you're going to have to manage that for long term and really think about what you're wanting for your family. And I'll share a couple of strategies for that later on in the presentation. Now, the experiences of caregivers vary widely. So, it depends on a lot of factors. It can be on the caregiver personality, like we said, the sudden versus gradual, short term, long term. It also depends on how intense the caregiving needs to be. So all of those can influence the experience of the caregiver, also how many resources they have at their disposal. So for some people, caregiving, there's a lot of positive, right? So you might gain a sense of confidence in your ability. You might find meaning or purpose in the caregiving. Maybe it gives you the opportunity to learn new skills or enhance some skills you already have. And a lot of people do actually report that their experience of caregiving brings them closer to their care partner, the person that's receiving the care. So it can help bring those relationships closer together. And at the same time, though, even though there can be a lot of positives, it can also be very stressful physically and emotionally. And again, it depends on a lot of factors, but even when there are all of those positives, it can still be a very stressful experience. So again, the level of stress is influenced on a variety of factors that we talked about. Plus, if families have limited financial resources, that can really make the situation more stressful, or if there's not very much social support, or maybe if there's challenges even with the physical home environment. So sometimes if there's a disability and the home just maybe isn't conducive to that situation, it can cause a lot more stress. So there can definitely be some physical and emotional stress associated with caregiving. Okay. And so now I'm gonna try something new with this, so bear with me. So I'm gonna try to share a YouTube video with you all, and we'll see if it plays. And hopefully you can let me know in the chat.
Hi, I've been asked when I realized that I was a caregiver. And I realized as a spousal caregiver, after 40 years of sharing and caring and taking care of one another and anticipating needs, that the beginning of caregiving is very blurred. So as I thought about it, I thought of three tsunami type events that really changed my role in caregiving. And the first was when and the first was when my husband, who had neuropathy from diabetes and had uncontrolled diabetes, had to stop driving. And that meant that all of the chores and all of the appointments fell on me, and I was the primary transporter of everything. And that became difficult because I was still working full time, and to fit all of that in was very tough and changed my schedules quite a bit. The second thing that happened was when Dan became confused, and um, he couldn't remember appointments, he couldn't remember foods, and my family started to make suggestions. And their suggestions were, you need to downsize, you need to move, you need to learn the financials and record keeping of the family. So that put another big load on my shoulders, and I was still trying to work full time. The third tsunami, and the last, which was the hardest, was the emotional uh, disconnect. And Dan became very weak and frail, and he couldn't handle his own personal care, and that was really very difficult for me. But I had to keep working. So my son, who was 26, quit his job so that he could stay home with his father. And it was a good relationship building time for them, but it was really an emotional and depressing time for me because we knew it was the end of his life. And so I guess those were the three tsunamis that the waves of caregiving change that I remember.
Okay, so hopefully you all got to hear her story. And I thought it was really interesting that she talked about the events in terms of this tsunami. So like this wave crashing over their family. But you can see that there's a lot of stress, even though she talked about some of the positives of the relationship building, about some of the emotional and physical stress. And so how do we know if there's some stress involved? And these are just some common experiences of caregivers. And so it's important to be aware of these because sometimes when we're in that caregiver role, we're so focused on caregiving that we forget to think about how it's impacting us. And it's important to be aware of that because caregivers are at an increased risk for physical and emotional stress. And not only does it take a toll on them, but it can affect the whole family and the family relationships. And too much stress, especially over a long time, can harm your health. And what research has shown is that caregivers are more likely to experience symptoms of anxiety and depression. And a lot of this is also due to, not only the situation that's at hand, but not taking care of their physical or emotional needs. And so some of these, the list here is just some examples of things that or signs of caregiver stress. So feeling overwhelmed or constantly worried, feeling tired often, getting too much sleep or not enough sleep, gaining or losing weight. So if there's a change that's not intentional, making becoming easily irritated or angry. So you can see how that can definitely impact relationships. Losing interest in activities you used to enjoy, feeling sad, having frequent headaches, bodily pain, or other physical problems, and abusing alcohol or drugs, including prescription medication. So there can be lots of consequences to having this stress in our lives. Now, one of the challenges or one of the causes of stress can be changing roles. So in families, we make decisions all the time about who's responsible for completing certain tasks or who's fulfilling certain responsibilities. And so in families, they have to decide who's going to, I mean, just regular everyday things like who's going to take out the trash, who's going to pick up the kids from school, who's going to cook dinner, who's going to watch children after they return from school, even things like who's going to provide financial support, who's going to pay the bills. I mean, all of these different roles are divided up in families. And hopefully, what the goal is to assign these in a way so that, not just one family member is overburdened, right? So it's like you split up all of these different roles in the family. But disease and disability can change these roles. And the change in these roles can affect how families are functioning. And so some of the tasks we're going to talk about in the next slide could be things like, financial tasks. Who's managing the finances of the family? Who's making those decisions? It can be chores around the house. Typically those are divided. And if one person or a couple of people aren't able to do those, then how is that shifted? We're going to talk a little bit about couple relationships and how intimacy can be affected, and also how relationships with maybe other outside family members or maybe with friends can be impacted. And so these changes can sort of ripple out into all of these different relationships. And so I'm going to talk about three different types of relationships and how caregiving can impact these relationships. So in terms of couple relationships, there's a couple of different scenarios that can go on with this. So in one scenario, and you saw from, the slide with the statistics that oftentimes there's one partner who's caring for the other partner. So that can be a huge shift change in roles. And then the other scenario that we'll talk about is when maybe there's a couple and they're caring for someone else. So maybe one of the partners there, maybe one of their parents, they have to care for them. So those are the two scenarios. One where one partner is caring for the other, and the other one that I'll talk about is where the couple is taking care of someone else. So in the first scenario, when one partner is caring for each other, the changes in terms of, they typically in a couple that you figured out who's responsible for what. And so when there's a change in that, it can cause a lot of stress. And especially if one partner's feeling like now it's this one-sided relationship, that can definitely lead to feelings of resentment, right? Because they're having to take on all of these roles that they hadn't had to in the past. And so on the flip side, though, the individual receiving care might start to worry that they're putting a burden on their partner or spouse. So there can be these very difficult emotions going on because the way things used to be are not how things can be at the moment. And then it can also take a serious toll on intimacy and emotional connections. And so this can be for a variety of different reasons. It could be the illness or the disease itself can make intimacy difficult. It can be the fact that you're just so tired and stressed, and or maybe one person isn't able to communicate like they used to, and so you don't have that emotional connection anymore. So, in that video, if you were able to hear, she talks about how that was one of the saddest things for her is to lose the connection. And it can also be that it can be challenging to provide those basic care needs and then see your partner as a romantic partner. So there's lots of different reasons why that intimacy and emotional connection can be affected. And unfortunately, without support, couple relationships and marriages can break under that stress. And so when studies have been done on these couple relationships where caregiving is involved, 80% reported that it did put a strain on their relationship. Estimates for divorce rates for couples where one spouse or partner has a serious chronic illness can be as high as 75%. So you can see that without some support, that can be a really big challenge for couples. Now, the other scenario that I talked about is one where maybe the couple has someone that they're caring for. So maybe they're caring for an aging parent. And so, some people are very fortunate. The caregiver may have a very understanding significant other and very supportive person, but that's not always the case. And even when you do have someone who's supportive, sometimes maybe the aging parents' care needs really, they increase and they can disrupt the family routines, and there can also be some feelings of resentment towards that person or some feelings of stress, and that can also put a stress on a marriage. The next couple or the next relationship I wanted to talk about is parent-child. And again, there's a couple of different things that can be going on here. So in one scenario, you can think of this more like the sandwich generation. So you've probably heard that term. And this is where someone is caring for an aging relative, but they also caring for young children in the home. So it's like this caregiver is caregiving, they're sandwiched in between these two generations where they're caring for their aging parent and then also for their children. And so there is some benefit for children to see, helping and caring for aging family members. So again, I don't want to take away from the benefits of these close relationships, but it can also put a stress on the family, especially if there aren't those resources for the family when they're going through this situation. And so some of the challenges in this situation would be trying to balance everybody's care needs, and including the caregiver themselves, right? I mean, there might be so much going on and it could put a stress on the family. And especially if, let's say that the caregiving needs are so great for the aging parent, without that support, then the parent who's providing the caregiving, so that adult, if they're completely focused on that, then they may be unavailable during the formative years of their children's lives. So that's where it becomes really important to figure out, okay, how can we balance all the needs of this family? And then in really bad situations, sometimes the person that you're caring for, maybe if it's some type of dementia, or maybe if it's a traumatic brain injury, some illnesses do cause people to get a little bit more aggressive. And so in bad situations, there could be a risk of children experiencing either verbal or physical abuse. And so, again, those are in worst case scenarios, but it is important to think about those types of things when you're providing care. And again, we'll talk about some of the resources, but it is important to seek support to balance everybody's care needs in the family. There are also changes. So that was one scenario where it's the sandwich generation, but another scenario is where you're you're an adult and then you're caring for your aging parent, and that can bring about some changes in roles. I mean, it really is a complete role reversal, right? So you may, as the child, feel like you're providing care to your parent who once took care of you, so you might see it as a positive, but it may also feel a little bit awkward. It may feel a little bit uncomfortable or unnatural for some parents because, maybe they feel like, I'm the parent, I should be providing care. I don't want my children to care for me. So that can cause some emotional distress with that role reversal. And so sometimes the aging parent, even if they realize they need the care, they may resent that they need to have the children take care of them. And sometimes the person who's providing the care can feel a little bit of resentment, especially if they're having, if they're part of that sandwich generation, right? Where they may feel some feelings of resentment because they have to care for their aging parent. So lots of different things can be going on. Caregiving can also affect family and friendships. So it's very, very easy for caregivers to become isolated and not stay connected with maybe other family members or with their friendship networks. And this is understandable too, because, you know, if caregiving is stressful, then there might be some feelings like, well, I can't really take time out. I'm so busy. I can't take time out to connect with my friends or to connect with other family members. So it might be feelings of guilt, like I'm not doing enough. And so you also might be so exhausted that having those phone calls just takes too much energy. And so what happens is maybe if you're not accepting those invitations to socialize, if you're not answering the phone call, if you're not taking time out to keep those connections up, then it's really easy to get isolated. And so at first, maybe your friends, they might be understanding, but eventually maybe those connections are lost. And so it's unfortunate because then that reduces the support network for that caregiver. So what can we do about it? So I have just a few suggestions of how to strengthen relationships when you're in the caregiving situation, and some of these can apply to all different types of relationships. But we'll start with the couple relationship first. So one is prioritize a relationship with your partner. So even just making the conscious effort to think about how you want to preserve and stay connected with your partner, just that consciousness can be so powerful. So it means talking to your partner about your concern, um, talking about how it might impact your relationship, and then expressing that desire to keep your relationship strong, and that just acknowledging that that is a priority. You also want to make communication a priority. And I do have a little side note for this. So in some situations, communication might be limited. So for example, if your partner has a condition like Alzheimer's or dementia or a severe stroke or traumatic brain injury, communication might be limited. So that's sort of a whole different situation. But in terms of if you can communicate with your partner in terms of brainstorming some ideas of how um, you can problem solve, that's definitely beneficial. And I do have a webinar that's focused on healthy communication because, and I do recommend watching that because communication, the challenging part about it is we tend to avoid any conversations that are difficult or that have things that maybe we feel guilty about expressing. So you might feel guilty, like how can I complain to my partner that I'm doing everything myself when they're in a wheelchair? So that might feel like, oh, how can I even share that with my partner? Like, how dare I think that? But being able to talk about those difficult emotions with your partner will definitely help strengthen that relationship. And also just carve out some time to just talk about things even outside of caregiving. um, and find time to express appreciation for the things that your partner does, or if you perceive them to be supportive. You know, having time to talk with your partner is important, and it can sort of get lost in those day-to-day caregiving activities. Also, make time to do things together that strengthen your relationship. And so again, these might be a couple of different scenarios. So for example, in that scenario where the couple is taking care of someone else, a really good strategy for this might be to look into what type of respite care you can have so that the two of you can spend time together. So whether it's a neighbor or a friend or a family member, or maybe if you can hire somebody, um, there are organizations that provide respite care. So if you can have that, then that shows that you're going to spend time with your partner, and you can work on that relationship, and you can show that it's a priority. So that could be one strategy. Um, so any time that you can spend together, even if it's small things. If you're providing care to your partner, it is also important to find ways to connect, even if there's small things like having coffee together, or maybe if you can go outside and sit in nature for a little bit, or even if you can't go outside, just sitting in front of a window and talking and looking outside, or seeing a show that you like, or walking the dog together, something. So there's small things that you can do every day to still maintain that connection with your partner. So make time to do things together. And then adopt a team mindset. So again, for the couple, it's thinking of yourselves as a team as you're working on this together, and you can brainstorm and problem solve things together. And it was really interesting in one of the articles that I read. It also said for caregivers to be careful not to completely take over all of the caregiving. If the person that you're providing care for can still do things, like let them do what they are able to do. Because sometimes as a caregiver, you try to take over everything. Sometimes it's just easier. But the more that you can allow the other person to do what they can do, that's beneficial to the relationship, because then they feel like they're contributing, and then you feel more like a team. So I thought that was a really good recommendation. So for the parent-child relationship, a lot of those things can still apply. So making communication a priority, spending time together, making sure that you're available to connect, having that team mindset. So all that can help. And then the other additional item that I have for this is just strategizing how you can balance care needs of all family members, again, including the caregiver. So it can be, again, respite care can be helpful, having a family plan, seeking support. All of those can also be helpful in strengthening parent-child relationship, whether it's a parent who's raising a younger child, or whether it's the parent caring for the aging adult parent. So any of those would work. And then for family and friends, I think here it's just, again, all of those other strategies will work, but just realizing how important it is to stay connected to those social networks. They can provide support and respite for you sometimes, and so that emotional support is very important, and they may even be able to help you with some of the other things. Like, so if you can take time to have a quick phone call, maybe have a cup of coffee together, maybe they can walk with you around the block. So there's lots of different ways that you can continue to stay connected to family and friends. I did find some information about adapting to changes when the person that you're providing care to has dementia, and there's entire workshops. So I'm just highlighting one of the aspects that help with connections and help building the relationships. But I do recommend, if there's an Alzheimer's association in your community, that you can connect with them, because there's entire workshops that focus more on this area. But One of the things that I did want to mention for, if you do have somebody with Alzheimer's or dementia, there's a lot of anxiety that can can happen with the person you're providing care to, and so that can really affect relationships. So these are just a few suggestions for how you can maybe manage some of that anxiety so that it helps with the caregiving. So the first one is gently guiding people to make their own decisions as much as possible. So it may not always be possible, but when someone has Alzheimer's or dementia and you're just telling them what to do, it can create anxiety and then the person can feel somewhat agitated. The other suggestion was to manage anxiety of situations. So this can just look, and this is connected to the next one, notice when stress tends to peak. So what you can do is just be aware of what's causing anxiety in the person and maybe be sort of planning how you might be able to reduce that. And so it's just being aware there might be certain times of the day that are more stressful or certain events that are more stressful. And so just notice when those are and then try to figure out how you can reduce that. And so there may be some certain triggers that a person has, and so you can try to avoid those triggers or try to figure out how you can reduce those. Because as soon as somebody feels frustrated and their anxiety goes up, then they can become pretty agitated. And then also using memory aids, so post-it notes or alarms. And so you can use all of these to really sort of plan the day in advance to figure out how you might be able to reduce some of those different anxiety causing events. And then this will help with the relationship because if their anxiety is reduced, and then it'll reduce the anxiety and stress that you're experiencing. So now the other part I wanted to talk about is, so when we're talking about caregiving and about relationships and about stress, one of the big, it's sort of a cause and a result of the stress, is all of these emotions. So we talked about some of the emotions that are really common, and so this is just to reiterate that. So it's very common to have feelings of sadness, irritability, anxiety, embarrassment, grief, or guilt. And it's important to know that these emotions will sort of increase and decrease over time, and so that's normal. But one thing that we do want to be aware of is that depression is common among caregivers, with 50% of caregivers reporting some feelings of depression. So it's important to recognize that so that we can figure out, okay, how can we work on addressing this? And so I wanted to talk about a few strategies of how we can manage some of these emotions. So one of the main concepts for managing difficult emotions is to understand how our thoughts and how we think about things and how we see things is connected so much to how we feel about things, to our emotions. And so with caregiving, one of the big challenges is that it's a huge change, right? I mean, we all know that change is a part of life and we anticipate certain changes, right? You might anticipate things like graduating from school, getting engaged, getting married, having children. You may envision all those. Those are anticipated. But then life throws you curveballs. And so there's these unanticipated changes, right? You may not have thought that this accident would have caused this disability, or you might not have thought that your loved one would have this illness or this disability. And so it throws a wrench in what you thought life was going to be like. And so the hard part about these situations is that you had your vision of how your life was going to look. And when that changes, there can be this really big sense of loss and even anger because you're just feeling like you're cheated out of something. And so that can cause a lot of difficult emotions. And so it can be challenging, but it's very powerful to think about how we're thinking about things or how we're seeing things. And so one strategy is to work on changing the vision. So I've seen, some inspirational memes that'll say, sometimes we have to let go of what we thought was going to be and find joy in what is. And so you have to, if you can change the vision and find joy in what your reality is, then that can really help with managing those emotions. So some of the suggestions that I read in terms of helping to change how you thought things were going to be, because we all have these dreams of what our life is going to be like or was going to be like. And so one was having a ceremony to grieve over the loss of dreams. So it could just be something like figuring out how to let go of what you thought was going to happen. And then creating new dreams based on realities. So this means focusing on what is possible. And so just finding small joys can be so powerful, and it can bring this sense of you can actually find different meaning, and that can really help with managing your emotion. Because if you're so focused on I don't like how things are, then that's all you're going to see instead of looking at some of the benefits to, some of the benefits that can come from this new situation. Another strategy so here's a couple of other strategies for managing difficult emotions, and these are, there's a organization, it's called the Self-Management Resource Center, and they have a really good book called Building Better Caregivers. And there's two strategies that they have, and you'll see that the adaptive thinking is very connected to the changing your vision. But I'm first going to talk about they have 4 steps to dealing with difficult emotions. And so these are just some guidelines of how you and your family can maybe work through some of these. Now, the first step is to acknowledge what you're feeling. So this can be a little bit tricky, especially if there's a lot of anger or a lot of anxiety. And if you don't want to acknowledge it, it can come out in different ways. So maybe you're angry, but then you end up taking it out on the family dog or maybe on the sales clerk, right? You have these outbursts of anger on them. And so it's because you're not wanting to acknowledge that you're having those emotions. The next step is to give the feelings a name. It doesn't even have to be exactly, don't worry about right or wrong. It's just acknowledging that you're feeling this emotion and also acknowledging that feeling it doesn't make you a bad person. Because sometimes we feel like if we have these uncomfortable emotions that somehow there's something wrong with us. But if you can give it a name, then it acknowledges that it exists. And it's normal to have feelings like anger and anxiety and guilt. The next step is to try to identify what's causing the feeling. So this can be a little bit tricky because there might be more than one cause for a feeling. So you might feel guilty because maybe you feel like you're not providing good enough care. Or maybe you feel guilty because you feel trapped in the situation. And so it's important to figure out what's causing that feeling. Because once you go through those steps, once you can acknowledge it, once you can give it a name, once you can identify what's causing it, once you can do all those 3 steps, then you can actually take action. And so I'm just going to list, there's a couple of strategies for what action you can take, but you can think of other things that might work for you. But one of the suggestions for taking action is just simple one, talking to somebody. And it's so amazing how actually saying things out loud can actually soften the emotions. So they might feel really, really intense inside, but if you can share them with someone that's supportive, then it can decrease that intensity. And so when we say talk to somebody, this really depends on who you're comfortable with, but it can be a social worker, it can be a counselor, it can be a friend. Maybe there's a religious leader that you're comfortable talking to. Maybe it's another family member, just someone so that you can talk to multiple people. And so that can really help. You can also decide to talk to a group. So there are different peer groups or support groups that are specific to different caregiving situations. So there might be one, again, for family members who, if you're caring for somebody with Alzheimer's, there might be a cancer support group either for the survivor or for the caregiver. There might be a group for people with traumatic brain injuries. So, lots of different types of support groups out there. So that's important because if you can connect with other people who are in your similar situation, then you don't feel so alone and you can also get very practical tips because they understand your situation. Another thing that you can do for taking action is writing in a journal. So lots of research has gone into how powerful journaling can be. So again, it's that same idea of if you can get that emotion out, if you can express it, it lessens it, it makes it more manageable. And so you can write it down. You don't have to show it to anybody. You can just write it, and it doesn't even have to take long. You can just jot things down for a few minutes. And one thing that can help you with a journal is your journal can then become this, you can actually go back and look and see maybe there's some patterns, maybe, so it's this record of your emotions over time. And so it can actually help you figure some things out once you start looking back. So it can provide you with really good insight. Um, if, let's say that your journaling causes you to feel more emotion, like maybe you're feeling it more strongly because you're actually thinking about it more, then you may want to go back to that first thing about talking to somebody, especially a professional. So you may need to seek out a counselor or a social worker or even your healthcare provider to see what types of help they can offer you. So those are 4 steps. So that's one strategy. The other strategy that's mentioned in this book, Building Better Caregivers, is called adaptive thinking. And it's connected very much to being able to change your vision. So it's the idea, again, that thoughts and emotions are very much connected. So for this strategy, what it asks you to do is one, identify frequent reoccurring thoughts. And so what it suggests here is you might even start out with just a sentence, for me, caregiving is, and then you fill in the blank. And so what you might find is maybe your thought and it asks you to write this thought down. So the example here would be caregiving is ruining my life. Nothing will ever be the same. So that might be something that you're thinking about constantly. So then the next step is think about how you might change that thought. And so, and to be more positive. So the example here would be, well, caregiving is really hard and I'm doing the best that I can. So that would be a way to acknowledge, I'm doing the best that I can. So you can change that. Another thing is, so here's another example. For me, caregiving is so frustrating. He can't do anything. All he does is shout and whine. He doesn't appreciate anything I do. So a way that that could be changed would be, for me, caregiving is a challenge. His good condition is hard for both of us. I will do what I can do to make him comfortable. I know he would thank me if he could. So again, it's changing how you're looking at things. It may not change the situation, but it gives a more positive twist to it or spin to it. And so it helps you think about things differently so that you're not feeling so maybe sad about the situation. So it's trying to look for the positive. And you can actually work on this. So this takes some time, but it is trying to look at things differently, change how you think about things, find those small joys. And then what happens is every time you have that thought, what you're doing is you're retraining your thoughts to have that more positive outlook so that eventually it helps with your emotions as well. So those are so changing vision, dealing with emotions, and adaptive thinking are some ways to manage emotions. Another strategy that helps, and this is for finding resources for having a plan. So this is again how to figure out how the family can adapt to the situation at hand. You know, especially when we think, you know, when we go into crisis mode, sometimes this sort of gets left behind and we don't have this organized way of doing things. But again, from that Building Better Caregivers book, it has a suggestion for holding family meetings. And so these are just some suggestions of how to hold effective family meetings. Again, you know your family's best and will know if this would work for you all. But the first one is to invite everyone who might be interested. So this might include not only family, but also friends. And not everybody has to be there. So it can be, you know, with technology, you can have people Skype in. You can even do this on a Google Doc. I mean, there's so many different ways to get people together. If possible, find a professional to run a meeting, or even just an outside person, or maybe somebody from your local faith-based organization, maybe an outsider. So that might actually help kind of take the stress off of a family member running it. Decide on what you're going to talk about ahead of time. So especially if you're the one running this meeting and you're going to be asking for help from people, then make sure that you have an agenda, because you want to be specific and get certain tasks done. It's not just an open discussion, it's very specific. Setting ground rules like making sure people are not interrupting, that, you know, and make sure everybody agrees upon that. You may want to start with a status report. So if you know there's a person that you know their health is you're caregiving because of specific health reasons, maybe give a status report on how they're doing, and then let everybody express how they feel. And avoid expressing anger and pushing emotional buttons. So the whole goal of this is really to try to figure out how to get the family to organize around addressing specific issues. So it'll be helpful to clearly express the problem and the specific help you want. Ask what each person can contribute. Don't tell people like, oh, you need to do this or you need to do that. This is more about seeing what everybody can contribute. And then write it down and provide a copy of that to everybody and try to hold regular meetings. So that's just one another suggestion for how families can work together on caregiving. And then definitely don't want to forget self-care. So one of the important things about families and relationships is you do have to take care of yourself in order to be able to give the best care that you can and also to be able to connect with everyone in your family. And so sometimes this can be very challenging for caregivers because especially if you're so focused on just giving everybody what they need, then you forget about yourself. And I like the analogy of you can't pour from an empty cup. And so if you're giving until you're empty, then your family's at a loss because there's no more of you to give. And so these are just some reminders of how to provide self-care to yourself. So for example, ask for and also accept help. Sometimes caregiving, you like things a certain way, or you know, we might have ideas of how we want things, and so we don't let other people help because it's not the way we would like. And so it's being a little bit more forgiving and flexible and accepting if people are offering help. Also focus on what you are able to provide. So really focus on that because that'll help alleviate your sense of guilt. You know, it can be guilty if you're not the perfect caregiver, but really just think about what can you provide. And then making time for yourself. So these can be even small things just so that you can recover and recuperate and have some time where you can recharge. We already talked about joining a caregiver support group, and that can also be related to seeking social support. So making sure that you are connected with your friends, making sure that you have those outside connections. And then this is really important, caring for your body. Sometimes, again, you're so focused on caring for the other person that you don't make time to meet your needs. And so you're not taking, so remember to eat right, to get enough rest, to exercise, to take time to relax, but also to go to all your checkups and to take your own medicines, because sometimes you'll make doctor's appointments for the person you're caring for, or you'll make sure they're taking their medications, but then you put off your own health. You don't make your appointments. You don't take your vitamins. And so it is important to take care of yourself as well. And then I have some resources, and these resources will be available on the handout that you'll be provided with. And so in any community, the Area Agency on Aging in New Mexico, it's through the Aging and Long-Term Services Department. So they have resources there. The Alzheimer's Association, I included the link to the one in New Mexico. And I know there might be some funding there to provide, I think, respite care. So you might want to look into that. And AARP, they have websites on their site for resources for caregivers, and then the Caregiver Action Network. So those are just some resources for you all. And then I'll show this video real quick. And then just a reminder, don't close out the session. I'll have to close out before you can get the survey, but I just wanted to show you this video. And I like it because it shows all the different types of caregiving. And while I'm setting up this video, if you can type in any questions you may have, I'd be happy to answer those.
Hello, rise and shine. Okay. Okay.
7, 8, 9. He said. No, again. She said.
Holy moly.
Put a little.
Okay. Better than mine.
Keep your hands up.
Yeah, okay, flip. There you go.
Okay, hopefully you all got to see that video. And if you're a caregiver, thank you so much for what you do. And if you know a caregiver, tell them thank you because it's a very important job in families, very important role. So that is my presentation. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat box. What'll happen now is I'll close out the session and then hopefully a survey will pop up. And once you complete that survey, then the handout with information from today's presentation will be sent to you. If you're part of a group that's watching the presentation on one computer, if you wouldn't mind emailing efcs@nmsu.edu, and Elian can send you each an individual survey to fill out and the handout. And then I did have the upcoming webinars, so hopefully you can join us on those. And with that, I'll just leave a little bit, no questions. Any question now? And then you're welcome. Okay, I don't see any questions. So I'll go ahead and close out and hopefully you all can fill out that survey. Thank you all so much.